let's get started. As always, it's so great to see the familiar faces. And those of you who are new to our Leaders Gathering, we certainly hope that you become regulars and that you join us each month. So I'll share a brief introduction for our new folks, especially about Loving Houston, to talk about where we've been and where we want to continue to go for 2021. So you guys have seen this map if you've been to our events before, but every dot on this map is a school. And so as you can see, there are schools all over our city. And we believe that when we have church partners for each of these schools, then every community will experience the love of Jesus in a tangible way. And so our mission at Loving Houston is to advance community transformation by helping churches serve local schools. And our vision is to see every school in Greater Houston with a committed and caring church partner. And we'll do this through our community transformation model, which includes relief, reconciliation, and development. And so if you've been joining our discussions, you know that we've been calling this our continuum, but now we have it as a Venn diagram because we know that each of your churches has strong suits. Some of you guys are going to be really equipped to provide relief. Some of you guys are going to be really concerned with reconciliation. But our role, our job at Loving Houston is to host events like this, host leaders gatherings where we bring in speakers that are going to equip you and resource you to be able to do all of these things and do all of them well and do all of them to the glory of God. And so our speaker is going to really kind of hit on this holistically with the presentation that she has for us today. Let's go through a couple of these terms. Relief is meeting immediate acute needs. So I mentioned this morning, but as a staff, we are reading When Helping Hurts by Brian Fickard and Steve Corbett. And they explain relief as the urgent temporary provision of emergency aid to reduce immediate suffering from a natural or man-made crisis. Providing relief can be seen as doing what needs to be done to stop the bleeding. So many of you are doing an excellent job at providing relief. Back in February, our February Leaders Gathering, we had Pastor Brian Lee come and give us some biblical imperatives about providing relief. And you can go to our YouTube page just to see that. You can search Loving Houston Brian Lee to see his talk. It was amazing. So many times churches show up eager to provide relief, and that's awesome because there are all sorts of opportunities to provide relief within our schools. And some examples include weekend meals, clothing drives, holiday events. All those sorts of things are ways that churches can come alongside schools and help provide relief. The next aspect of our community development model is reconciliation. So reconciliation is moving beyond providing relief to restoring relationships. And once the bleeding stops, how do we help position others so that the crises that they've been in aren't reoccurring? We have to acknowledge that some of the crises our families find themselves in are due to systemic issues in our society. And also each of us needs a savior for our souls. So when we think about reconciliation, we're thinking about reconciling folks back to God through the gospel and also reconciling us with one another. This work is hard. This work is tough. It requires our churches to not just stop in and do stuff. It requires churches to be relational. And there are some practical ways that you can do that. There are good news clubs, FCA, Crew, Young Life. These are already national programs that are approved in many of our schools and provide you the mechanism to be able to go on a school campus and talk about Jesus. Also, in just the building of relationships, Purpose talked about this morning, and just being present. There's so much reconciliation that happens with you guys being present and helping to fix some of the fractions that we have in our society. Development includes investing in people in such a way that those who've impacted become those who impact others. That means the buck doesn't stop with you. Churches who are excelling in Christian community development are investing in the next generation of leaders to help them equip them to take up the mantle to keep their communities thriving. And so we have on our YouTube page, on our website, you'll find our speakers from throughout the year that have been talking about relief, reconciliation, and development. Some examples of this is offering job skills and financial education, partnering with local businesses to get folks hired who are looking for jobs, mentoring and tutoring, making sure that we're helping, especially nowadays, close so much of the gaps that our students have experienced. So each model is very important, and we want to make sure we do our due diligence to help you be prepared to serve and love your school partner well. So we are going to pray. Sherry, will you lead us in prayer?
Oh, Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time, Father, to be aware of the resources available to us to serve you in our community. Father God, I just pray for Sonja as she presents, Father, that you will give her full mind and spirit, Father, to speak the words that you want delivered to us this day. Father God, give us good listening ears and just soak up all this opportunity for this resource. Father, be with us during this moment of good attentiveness. It's in your Son's name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sherry. So I have the pleasure of introducing Sonja. Sonja is a native Houstonian with a passion for making Houston a great home for all. As the daughter of two immigrants, she knows firsthand the value of hard work, access to quality education, and strong, inclusive support networks. Sonja currently serves as the president and CEO of MAM, Memorial Assistance Ministries, one of Houston's largest faith-based social service organizations whose mission is to build strong families, a dynamic workforce, and vibrant communities together. Harnessing the power of community, MAM offers holistic support to help families develop the skills, resources, and confidence they need to gain stability and experience a quality of life. Sonja holds a BA in sociology from Rice University and a master's in education from Stanford University. In addition to her work in nonprofit, Sonja and her husband own a small business in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, focused on literacy and education. They live in the Houston area with their 3 children and love spending time with family and traveling. Their life's mission is to seek justice, love, and mercy, and walk humbly with God. You guys, please let us welcome Sonja Gee.
Good morning. Oh, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start my timer to make sure that I get us out on time. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And, I'm here to present, but I'm really here to learn together with each of you as well. So I'm going to make this a little interactive. I hope you guys can participate with me in the chat as we go through some of this information. And actually, Brittany, gave half of the presentation. She did a great setup in talking about the difference between relief and development and reconciliation. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if technology is on my side. So as Brittany mentioned, I'm the daughter of 2 immigrants, and so I know very well what it's like for a family to come. In my dad's case, my dad and my grandparents were some of the first Chinese to immigrate to Texas. And so when they were here, it was a time when the South was still segregated, and, Asians were considered people of color, and there was a lot of limitations to which, our family is able to participate fully in society. But one thing that was really powerful about what happened in the very small Chinese community at the time was they had the first Chinese restaurants in the area. And when new folks would come in, either from China or coming out from California, this community of people would care for each other. And while they couldn't necessarily live in residential areas, they would give people a place to stay in the back of the grocery store, in the back of the restaurant. And so you really got a chance to see how a loving, supportive community and those, this ethnic enclave was able to help people to flourish, even within some of the limitations that they were facing in the greater society. Fortunately, a lot of things have changed since then. My kids today can't even imagine a world that is segregated in the way that their grandparents had to live through. But we also recognize that there continue to be a lot of challenges, in our country, in our community. But for our family, one thing that was critically important was public education, a quality education, and support from the local community. So my dad was really fortunate that when he grew up in Houston, Texas had different educational laws than Louisiana and Mississippi and others. And Asians were actually able to go to, at the time, which were white schools, and he was able to get a really strong education, which enabled him then to go on to pursue a law degree. He struggled to get work after that because, firms weren't hiring folks that weren't white males at the time. But he was able to start his own small business and, became really one of the more prominent immigration attorneys in the region. And so I'm really proud of that. And when Brittany was talking about the impact of development being that those who were impacted could then impact others, it brings me just such joy to be able to serve in a place like MAM, because it's my family's story and it's the opportunities that were afforded to my family that have allowed me to go on and get a great education, be able to raise a healthy family. And so it's my calling as a follower of Christ and as somebody with the lived experience to really live into providing those opportunities to the rest of the community as well. So I want to tell you just a little bit about MAM and then go into this conversation around, the difference between providing relief and providing, opportunities for development in our community. So at MAM, where I work, we believe that stable families and healthy, vibrant communities are at the heart of making Houston a great home for all. And we envision a Houston of boundless opportunities. So it doesn't matter what zip code you live in. It doesn't matter the socioeconomic status of your family. You can live in a stable household filled with hope, stability, and belonging. So I want everyone just to take a second. I know, it's noon. We've already probably been to too many Zoom meetings today. And sometimes we just get stuck in the day-to-day. And I want us all to close our eyes just for a second. And I want us to think about the term shalom, right? Shalom is this idea of wholeness, everything working together, the way God intended our world to be, our relationships to be. It's universal flourishing. It's, everything, there is a richness and our needs are satisfied with beautiful natural gifts. What does a community look like if shalom describes our community? Okay. So in the chat, why don't you throw in just a word or two of what was different about this shalom community that you envisioned than potentially what we see in the Houston community today?
Sonja, we have safety and well-being, helping one another, giving, unity between people despite differences, collaboration, equitable.
Absolutely. So we at MAM, and I think probably everyone who's on this call, believes that people in our community are capable, they're creative, they're full of potential. So, maybe somebody saw my grandparents and they didn't speak English when they came here, or my dad and, his food looked different, or, but as a community, we decided it's worth investing in this kid. We want to make sure he gets a good education and his family has opportunities. And ultimately, we have been blessed. And I feel like today I'm blessed to be a part of blessing others as well, right? And we believe that everybody has goals and desires and things that God has inherently created them to be. And our job is really just to walk alongside the community, just like Loving Houston does with schools. Your faith communities are there to walk alongside others and help them grow into their goals and to their potential. So Brittany asked me, what's the biblical mandate here, right? And for me, it's, kind of the simplest, but also sometimes the most complicated. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. And I feel like today, sometimes in some circumstances for it sometimes feels like this is harder and harder to do. What does it really mean to love your neighbor as yourself, to want the best for your neighbor? When I think about loving, it's typically you first have to love yourself. Then you learn to love other people like you, people in your tribe. And then you learn to love those who are different from yourself. And it's often very progressional. And so I think that, it's a challenge, and it's a challenge when people that are different than me have had different life experiences, have different values, have different culture, maybe even have a different faith perspective. And so to be able to learn to love, I think it's a challenge, but it's also a great mandate and part of our life as a Christian community. And so I'm really excited about the work of Loving Houston, because I think that's exactly what it does. It creates a platform for us to be in a loving, caring relationship with all of our neighbors, whether they're our next door neighbors or people, within, a different area of our city, but these are all people that make up our community. So you all kind of heard this, give the man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime. And so as we talk about this idea between relief and development, I like kind of meditating on this. And I heard somebody one time say, well, this is kind of the distinction between relief and development, right? That education. But I think we have to, Loving Houston has that, the Venn diagram that also talks about reconciliation. And the reality is, in addition to teaching and providing education, we also have to make sure that there's equity and opportunities, because you can educate people, but not necessarily give them opportunities. And then nor they nor the rest of our community are allowed to flourish based on the education they've been given. And so I think you can take this sort of metaphor a little bit further and say, beyond that education or development, there is empowerment and justice, which is not just teaching a man how to fish, but teaching them how to get fishing equipment and how to find the ponds. And justice is tearing down the fence around the pond. And so I think that our work, there's a whole spectrum of it, and we each play a different role in that. But I think until we're able to really, approach all of it, we will continue to fall short of this ability to truly love one another. So different types of help. Again, Brittany kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to kind of go through a little graphic diagram of how I see the different types of help. So, here you have somebody, they're basically, by and large, living a stable life, and then a crisis happens, right? What do? We want to help people, right? And so the first thing that we do often is we have to, as Brittany mentioned, we do relief work, which means stop the bleeding. It's temporary. It happens right after the crisis, and it's something short term, right? So in the chat, what is an example of a crisis that could occur in someone's life that could require help or support afterwards?
Flood, COVID, fire, losing everything and need stuff, job loss, illness.
Absolutely. There is a spectrum of things from individual to societal things. And so, a flood, a hurricane's an easy one to kind of talk about this. Okay, people got flooded. What do they need those first couple hours or first days right after they get flooded? Throw that in the chat.
Place to live, clothes. Mm-hmm. I didn't put that in the chat, but that's actually happened to us. So.
Yeah, absolutely. People need clothes. They need food and water. They need a place to live, right? That is relief work. It is people they may not know that aren't involved in their life, but that can help them meet a very immediate and critical acute need. That is relief work. It's important, it's necessary, and it's good in that stage of someone's need. Now, after that, okay, they've been at George R. Brown, they've been at your church, they've been at, the uncle's house for a few weeks. They now have clothes, they're eating, maybe they're back to their job, maybe they lost their job. What happens next? So the next stage is recovery or rehabilitation, sometimes it's called. And this is helping people get back to where they were, so back to that level of stability before the crisis occurred. what are some of the types of things that might include? So in this case, of the flood, what needs to happen in the recovery stage?
Construction assistance and rebuilding.
Okay, so if their house got flooded, they need to have their house rebuilt to get back to the housing security they had. What else? So if they lost their job, they may need to get another job, right? Those are the types of things that happen during recovery, right? And then once they're kind of back to a similar state where they were before, the type of help that we can provide is what we call development, right? So development is an ongoing process where you're working with people and communities, happens during the normal circumstances in their life or after the recovery period of crisis, and it's ongoing, and it includes education. Brittany mentioned it can be, skill development and all of the things that help increase the resources of the individual or community so that at the time of the next crisis, they're more resilient. And the idea is that their level of stability increases to the point of which, they don't necessarily have to need as much relief and recovery support, right? So on to thriving. So, you can look at these three different types of help and they're very distinct. And what's important about them is to understand the difference, because if we apply the right kind of help at the wrong time, so good help, but at the wrong time or for the wrong duration, it can actually harm an individual and a community. And that's something that it's hard to hear because you think I'm here to help and I'm here to, love somebody. But, as the title of the book that they're studying, when helping hurts, or some of you may have heard of toxic charity, certainly we understand that even if we have good intentions, like the process does matter and the impact could be something negative. So we want to be mindful. So like we talked about, relief is that immediate, temporary, right after a crisis help. Recovery is restoring people to their, state before the crisis. And then development is this ongoing process. Now, when is it done? We talked about it, in the context of a crisis, right? Relief immediately after. Rehabilitation is a longer process. And then development is when things are kind of back to normal. How long do each of these stages last? Now, this isn't defined by a couple hours or a couple of days, but in general, relief should be short term. It should not be something regular and repeated. Recovery takes longer, but it's temporary. It's not something also that's ongoing, whereas development work is ongoing. It's lifelong learning and building resources in our community. And then this is something that I think is really important. This question about where resources come from. And when we talk about these issues of justice and we talk about power dynamics, this matters a lot, right? When relief happens, and we just saw this, right? Like, poor Louisiana, I'm very grateful that Houston didn't experience a hurricane. But, we see the suffering of, our neighbors in Louisiana once again. And so what happens? Well, when somebody's in that situation, does anybody say to them, oh, they need to be pulling up their bootstraps, they should be figuring out how they need to get housing or where they're going to eat? No, like humanitarian wise, we all recognize that person is in a point of acute suffering by, in this case, no cause of their own. And it's absolutely helpful to be able just to help them meet that immediate need. And that has to be limited. The time of which they're at a shelter and someone's providing them food and someone is meeting those needs is really just to help them bridge into the next stage, which is recovery, right? Then it tends to be, more of the local community or person who's in the crisis situation using their resources. So when, Louisiana floods, a lot of us will make donations into that city, even though we're not from there, right? But in the recovery process, that really comes internally from a community, right? So, when we were recovering from, Hurricane Harvey, certainly we would get federal funds and some support, but a lot of it really had to come from our community. And then development really depends on the local resources. And the reason that this is important is because, Very often when we're in partnerships, especially with communities that we don't live in or we're not a part of, it's very tempting for us to continue to want to be, bankrolling the different opportunities in that community. But the only way we will ever get to sustainable communities is if the tools and resources are developed within the community and the resources come in the community and develop them for the community. Now, certainly there's, systemic and equity issues that historically have affected that. But in an ideal sense, that's the way the process should look like. And then the other question around power is like, who is it that should be leading these different processes? And again, when we're talking about relief, it can be somebody on the outside, right? But the closer we get to development, it really needs to be locals, right? So that's, again, a beautiful thing about, the model with Loving Houston is at the end of the day, you're working with a school and the school is the local community, right? They are the people that on a day-to-day basis are working with the students, that they know them, they're a part of their lives. And so, as a church, you get a chance to, if it's not necessarily a community you're involved in on a day-to-day, working with those local people, but the local community should be the one really leading the strategy because they understand their community, they know the assets they have, the challenges, and it becomes a big challenge when it's the outsiders that are kind of trying to take that lead. I was a global missionary for over a decade and certainly saw, the challenges between like American churches trying to pour resources into, even, church organizations in foreign countries, and just the struggle between an understanding of the need for the local communities to have decision-making power in the work. And ultimately, what type of action is taken? And, Brittany kind of covered this. And, relief work often is just, you're reacting to a need. You're trying to fix it, trying to cure it. Whereas development is much more about enabling and teaching and coaching and helping resources be developed and built within a community. So I hope that kind of makes sense and helps, give a framework. And I just love this quote that says, if you've come to help me, because so often, we want to be helpful, we want to be servants. But it says, if you've come to help me, you can just go home. But if you see my struggles as part of your own survival, then perhaps we can work together. And I think this is a really powerful quote that, speaks to this idea that like, no one wants to be fixed, right? We all want to be valued. We all have inherent dignity, and we definitely need each other, regardless of what socioeconomic status we're in, or regardless of what position we're in. We all need each other to learn and grow and build that shalom that I think God calls us into. So what's the end result? So over time, if you keep providing relief beyond a time when it's something you should be doing, then it can cause dependency. It can cause exhaustion from those who are trying to provide relief. And it's frustrating. I've certainly been in organizations where lots and lots of relief was being provided. And at some point it's like, when are these people going to really actually change? And we just can't keep raising money for this problem and that sort of thing. Whereas development creates independence and sustainability from within. So the first example I gave talked about this idea of people starting out with stability, but the grand reality is that in most of the cases of a lot of the families we serve, our families are starting out at a place where they don't actually have stability on a day-to-day basis, right? And so what does this mean? Well, what it means is if we are trying to provide either relief or recovery in those cases, it is not necessarily what our families most need to be able to thrive, and it can be detrimental. And the reality is that in order to get to a place of stability, notwithstanding even a crisis, it requires development work. Now, what is important to know is within the skill building and the other things that are part of education, that are part of development, it often still requires assistance, right? So financial assistance and other things, because often those that we're serving, because of systemic issues, because of, family history, they may not have had the resources necessary to actually even engage in the development work. So the thing that we tell people is, okay, if you're working with a family and you want to help them move to be earning a living wage, right? They're earning minimum wage. For them to gain the skills to do that, how do they have the time? Well, maybe somebody has to help them pay their rent so they can go to school and earn the skills so they can then move on to the living wage job. So it's not a one or the other, but really a both and. So we think about, this long-term trajectory to stability, starting with people who are in like acute crisis, somebody who might be homeless or on the verge of eviction, to people who are vulnerable. They're constantly unable to meet their basic needs. Those who are stable, so, they're able to meet the basic needs, but they're receiving assistance. And it might be government, sponsored, it might be SNAP and CHIP and Gold Card, but it might also be churches and, aunts and uncles and grandpas and organizations like MAM. So you're stable, but you really continue to need the support of others. To the stage of self-sufficiency, which means that not that you're independent self-sufficient, right? But the fact that you're able to provide with limited or, just very occasional assistance to pay for your basic needs and do a little bit of savings, maybe pay off some debt, to ultimately people in a community who are able to meet their basic needs without assistance and have some discretionary income for saving in emergencies. The reality right now is there are far too many families in our community that fall within the vulnerability, crisis vulnerability, and barely stable to be sustainable. All right, so I'm actually going to skip this for a matter of time. I usually do this as a handout, but I'll give you a second just to look at this. This is a tool that we use with our community members to help them think about where are they in terms of stability in their life. Because sometimes it just feels like, oh, I'm doing okay. But when they really are able to look at the different elements in their life that are necessary to be stable, this is a helpful tool to be objective. So, can you see past today? Are you planning on a day-to-day basis? Or are you able to plan 10 or 20 years in the future, right? How much are you spending on your housing? How does your physical and mental health impact your day-to-day functioning? So what we always have people do is think about, where do you fall on this stability scale? And then in the community you're serving, at the school or, that you're working with, where do most of the families in the community you're working with fall on the stability scale? Okay, so in the chat, really quickly, why do you think people are in poverty? What are the causes that you think create poverty in our community?
Lack of education or dropping out. Limited opportunities, lack of advocates and positive connections and mentors, systemic ills, systemic barriers.
Yeah, all good answers, right? There's a lot of different reasons why people in our community are in poverty. And I like to say, it's not because of a lack of resources. We live in the wealthiest nation in the world. And I think it's really a shame how many people struggle to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis, considering that, right? But I think it's important for us to think about what causes poverty, because if we believe that, the reason that there's poverty is a lack of knowledge, then, we're going to educate people. If we think it's because there's oppression and, systems are unjust, then we're going to work towards social justice. If we think it's because of individual sins and decisions people are making, then we may evangelize or disciple the poor. And if we think it's because of a lack of material goods, then we might give stuff to people, right? And so the way we understand poverty deeply impacts the way that we're trying to work to eradicate poverty. And, I don't think any of these are the right or the wrong answer. I think it is, a very complex thing that incorporates lots of different reasons. But I do think it's important for us to think about for ourselves how we envision poverty, because that lens also affects how we treat others and the work that we do. So just to give you a quick quiz here, what percentage of Harris County residents do you think do not have $400 to meet an emergency expense?
We've got 50%, 70%, 90, 80, 75.
Okay, those are good guesses. We're not quite that bad off, but it's it's 40%. But if you think about that, 40% of our population doesn't have $400 in savings. When you think about stability, how far are we planning ahead? Half of our community is really living day to day, right? In the wealthiest nation in the world, right? So this is a MAM statistic, but in the folks that we serve, 81% of our clients, our community members, earn less than $25,000 a year. And so just to get a sense of that, what percentage do you think spend of their income do you think spend on rent? So, statistically speaking, we talk about affordable housing is 30% of your income spent on rent, right? So that gives you, the rest 70% of your income to be able to provide for the other needs of your family. But in families that are under $25,000 a year, which is probably also a lot of the families in the schools that you all are supporting, guess how much they're spending on their rent?
We've got in the chat anywhere from 50, most of everybody says 50%, some 75%.
You got it. So most families under $25,000 a year are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. So I always tell people, just pause and think about your own family and how would it impact you if you had to spend 50 to 60% of your income on rent. So affordable housing is a critical challenge that we have in our city. So I put this slide in here just because often you can tell from the crowd that you're with when people talk about the causes of poverty, where we stand politically, because there's a tendency to think about poverty as an individual behavior or based on jobs versus the systemic things, although I think that's shifting and changing. So I think that this is helpful to see because it helps us be conscious about our own lens to be able to, engage in objective conversations around it. So when I think about poverty, the definition we use is it's the extent to which an individual or community lacks resources. You don't have the resources to do what you need to do to make ends meet, to have wellness, right? And those resources can look like different things. It can be about your health. It can be economics. It can be about your mental health, your spiritual health. It's in a lot of different areas. But it can also be in things like in Houston, how many folks don't have a computer? 1 in 6 households don't have a computer. Think about how essential computers are today to our day-to-day functioning. How many don't have broadband internet? 1 out of 3 families. So, these are things that also impact, a family and their well-being. So mental health, right? Where do we stand on mental health? After COVID, 77% of low-income Houstonians experienced frequency of feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, right? So when we think about resources, we have to go beyond thinking that poverty and resources are just about financials, right? And I think it's similar when we talk about education. So you're all in the space of education, and educators are there to help, children be able to learn. But the reality is a child's ability to learn is based on their and their family's ability to be stable, which requires a multitude of different resources. And it's not just about education. It has to incorporate all of these different things. So in the work we do, we talk about what are called social determinants of health. So these are all of the different social reasons that impact our health. But I think there's something very similar. You could almost say social determinants of education, right? Like an ability of a child to learn and be healthy and grow into their potential have more to do even, than to the education, the job status, family support, income. It's not just about money. And it's also not just about, somebody's behavior or, even their spirituality. Somebody could be highly resourced in the area of spirituality. They could be deeply connected with God and with purpose, but, they may be in a neighborhood that is, lacking of different resources, and therefore they're unable to grow into their full potential. So these are all of the different areas that impact us. This is the service area that MAM's in. So you guys could do this for the whole Loving Houston, which would be huge, right? But this is a social, this looks at ALICE. So ALICE is asset limited, income constrained, employed folks. So folks who are working poor, they're working, but they just aren't making ends meet. And as you can see, there are communities that, 75% of the community members aren't able to make ends meet, right? And I want to show you something really impactful. This is the same map, but looking at life expectancy. There's a 15-year range between some of the more vulnerable zip codes and the higher resource zip codes in life expectancy. So if you can imagine that in the sense of health, imagine also in the sense of education and the implications. So when we think about, helping communities and helping, I think, schools have taken on a whole lot more than just the education. In some ways, people think of schools almost as they have to fix all of these things, when really it's a responsibility of all of us to be a part of creating, healthy communities. So this is from Mother Teresa, and she says, the greatest disease in the West is not TB or leprosy. It's being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for. We can cure physical diseases with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, despair, and hopelessness is love. There are many in the world who are dying for a piece of bread, but there are many more dying for love. And so as we think about the resources people need, it's not just financial, but what each one of you are doing, which is investing time and interest in people's lives and loving them. And so, Brittany asked me to do some takeaways. So we think about our work in this way, that there's 3 key things that help people move out of poverty: relationships, education, and employment. And I think that in any way that you're investing your time in the development of people and development of communities in one of these areas, you are helping to bring about that shalom into our world. So when we think about knowledge and learning from one another, how we spend our time determines our knowledge, right? And so this is an Asian family making dumplings, and then my husband's Mexican, a Latino family making tamales, right? So where I grow up and where I spend my time has a lot to do with what I know, right? And whether it's about fun things like that, or whether it's about what I'm surrounded by in my communities and how I think about using my time, when we have community members that the majority of their time is spent just surviving, they learn how to survive. They learn how to use their resources to get by day to day, and therefore they are never able to use their resources to think about a better future and to invest in a better future. And that's something that many of us can do something about, both by building communities that have other resources, but being mentors or people in other people's lives that can help them step out of the situation that they're in and see a different opportunity for their future. So really excited for the work that each of you is doing. I think it's incredibly meaningful. And, today, so many jobs, we've gone from, an agricultural economy to then industrial economy to now a knowledge-based economy. And in a knowledge-based economy, the need for education is greater than in any other point in time. And this is what job requirements are now, right? Even just, 40 years ago, the amount of people that needed beyond a high school diploma was much less. And today, the grand majority of jobs require beyond a high school education. And the question is, are we investing in our communities enough so that our children and the future workforce of our community have the education they need to be in those jobs? This is development work. You guys are in it every day, but it's ensuring that they will all have the tools so that they can be impacted and then be the ones to impact the next generation.